50 women, and Dante Moretti hadn't spared a single one a second glance. He stood in the gilded heart of a Manhattan ballroom, a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand, watching a parade of supermodels glide past like high-priced statues auditioning for his favor. Their designer gowns shimmered under chandeliers that cost more than a Brooklyn city block, and their smiles were as sharp, and as fake, as the diamonds at their throats. To them, this gala was a hunting ground. To Dante, it was a room full of beautiful lies, and he felt absolutely nothing. But then, the expected pattern broke. No bow. No rehearsed smile. Just a pair of wide, startled hazel eyes that saw the man, not the monster. At 40, Dante exuded a sense of dangerous authority that made even the city's most powerful men lower their voices. He was the head of the Moretti crime family, a man of old money menace who controlled everything from the shipping docks to the city's skyline. He stood broad-shouldered in a bespoke black tuxedo, his dark, predatory eyes having seen far too much violence to ever look truly soft. He had learned young that a pretty face usually hid the ugliest intentions, which is why he usually avoided cameras like they were bullets. But Elara Vance wasn't a supermodel. She was a hidden gem, in a simple white button-down and a black vest, thrust into a world of vipers. She was a waitress whose only job was to be invisible. Yet, when she looked at him and forgot the mandatory protocol to bow, Dante didn't feel anger. He felt a punch to the chest. For the first time in a decade, the ruthless boss of New York was frozen in his tracks, and he suddenly needed to know her name more than he needed his next breath. Welcome back to Underworld Love Chapters, where we dive deep into the hearts of the most dangerous men in the city. If you're a fan of possessive alphas and the hidden gem tropes that make your heart race, you're in the right place. To my loyal subscribers, thank you for building this empire with me. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our inner circle of dark romance. Now, let's get back to the man who just broke every rule for a girl in a waitress uniform. Dante Moretti didn't just walk, he moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. As he cut through the crowd, the sea of silk and diamonds parted instinctively. His business partner, Lorenzo, hurried to keep pace, his polished shoes clicking frantically against the marble. "Dante, for the love of God, where are you going?" Lorenzo hissed, glancing nervously at the rows of confused supermodels they were abandoning. "The mayor is waiting for a word. The Volkov brothers are watching. You can't just sprint away from 50 of the world's most beautiful women because a service girl forgot to dip her head." Dante didn't answer. He didn't even look back. His eyes were locked on the swinging double doors where the flash of a white shirt and a black vest had just vanished. His heart, usually a cold, rhythmic machine calibrated for business and bloodshed, was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the staff entrance and shoved the doors open. The sudden transition from the scent of expensive perfume and aged bourbon to the smell of industrial cleaner and frantic silver polish was jarring. The hallway was a maze of stainless steel and white tile. Servers scrambled past him with empty trays, their faces blurs of exhaustion. "Where is she?" Dante demanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that serrated edge, the tone that usually preceded someone losing a limb or a livelihood. A young busboy froze, nearly dropping a stack of china. "Who, sir?" "The girl," Dante said, his fingers tightening around his empty glass until the crystal threatened to shatter. "The waitress with the hazel eyes. The one who was just on the floor." The busboy pointed a trembling finger toward the locker rooms. "Elara? She just went on break, sir." She looked upset. She thought she was going to be fired for. Dante didn't wait for the end of the sentence. He moved toward the back exit, the heavy tuxedo jacket feeling like lead weights on his shoulders. He burst through the heavy steel door into the cool, damp air of the Manhattan alleyway. She was there. Elara Vance was leaning against a brick wall, her head tilted back, eyes closed. The hidden gem he had seen under the chandeliers looked even more devastating in the dim, flickering light of an alleyway street lamp. A few wavy tendrils of light brown hair had escaped her tie, dancing in the breeze. She looked fragile, yet there was a stubborn strength in the way she held herself, a woman who was used to standing her ground even when the world tried to push her over. She heard the door and her eyes snapped open. When she saw him, the man with the geometric tattoo creeping up his neck and the eyes of a wolf, she let out a small, sharp gasp. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize. Instead, she pressed her back against the bricks, her hands clenching at her sides. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "I know the rules. I know I was supposed to bow. I got distracted. Please don't tell my manager. I need this job. My mom, she—" "I don't care about the bow," Dante interrupted. He took a step forward, closing the distance until he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and soap clinging to her. "I don't care about the gala, or the mayor, or the 50 dolls in the other room pretending to be women." Elara blinked, her long lashes casting shadows on her cheeks. "Then why are you out here? Men like you don't come into alleys to talk to people like me. Men like me spend their entire lives surrounded by people who say exactly what we want to hear," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "They bow because they're afraid. They smile because they want a piece of the empire. But you—" He reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from her face before he pulled it back, as if afraid he might break her. "You looked at me like I was a person. Like I was just a man." Elara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the ballroom. "Maybe that's because I don't know who you are. I just saw someone who looked lonely." The word hit Dante harder than any bullet ever had. Lonely. In a room of 500 people, she was the only one who had seen the truth. He felt the ruthless armor he had worn for 20 years start to crumble, piece by agonizing piece. "My name is Dante," he said quietly. "I'm Elara," she replied, her fear slowly being replaced by a piercing curiosity that matched his own. For a moment, the sounds of the city faded. The sirens, the honking taxis, the muffled music from the ballroom, it all disappeared. There was only the boss and the waitress, a predator and a girl who refused to be prey, standing in the dark. "Elara," Dante repeated, the name tasting like a confession on his tongue. "Tomorrow, I'm going to find you. And when I do, you're going to tell me why you weren't afraid of me." "I am afraid of you," she admitted, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "But I think you're more afraid of yourself." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley before Dante could find his voice. He stood there, the most feared man in New York, completely paralyzed. He had come out here to hunt, to demand an explanation, to exert his power. But as he watched her go, he realized the power dynamic had shifted forever. He hadn't just found a girl, he had found a mirror. And for the first time in his life, Dante Moretti was terrified of what he saw inside. He walked back toward the gala, but he didn't go back inside. He kept walking, ignoring Lorenzo's calls, ignoring the empire, ignoring everything but the memory of hazel eyes that didn't know how to lie. The ballroom freeze was over, but the fire had just begun. And Dante knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that he would burn his entire world to the ground just to see her smile like that again. The sun hadn't even fully cleared the Manhattan skyline before Dante Moretti was back in the digital trenches of his empire. In the underworld, information was more valuable than heroin and more permanent than a blood oath. He sat in his private study, the room smelling of old leather and cold ambition, staring at 3 high-resolution monitors that illuminated the geometric ink on his neck. Find her, he had told Lorenzo at midnight. Now, at 6 in the morning, the file was already waiting. Dante scrolled through the data, his predatory gaze softening as he read the name, Elara Vance. 24 years old. No criminal record. A student at NYU on a scholarship that had dried up when her mother got sick. She worked 3 jobs, the Waldorf gig, a night shift at a 24-hour laundromat, and her main anchor, a small, weather diner in a corner of Brooklyn that the gentrification wave had forgotten. He studied her DMV photo. Even in the harsh, flat lighting of a government camera, that same unpolished defiance radiated from her eyes. She wasn't a supermodel, she was a survivor. To Dante, who had spent 40 years surrounded by people who folded at the first sign of pressure, her resilience was more intoxicating than the rarest vintage in his cellar. "You're obsessed, Dante," Lorenzo's voice crackled through the intercom. "The Volkovs are moving on the docks, and you're reading the transcripts of a waitress's high school GPA. This isn't like you." "That's because I've never met anyone like her," Dante replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stood up, the bespoke silk of his shirt straining against his broad shoulders. "And the Volkovs can wait. They aren't going anywhere. But she is." He didn't take the armored SUV. He didn't take the security detail that usually followed him like a funeral procession. Instead, he took the Ducati, weaving through the morning traffic like a dark streak of lightning, crossing the bridge into a world that didn't care about the Moretti name. The diner was a relic of chrome and cracked vinyl. The smell of burnt coffee and cheap grease hit him as he pushed open the door, the bell chiming a cheerful warning. Dante looked entirely out of place in his $1,000 casual wear, a wolf in a sheep's pen. He scanned the room until his eyes locked onto a head of wavy brown hair pulled back with a simple pencil. Elara was balancing 3 plates on her arm, moving with a grace that was purely functional, not performed. She hadn't seen him yet. She was laughing at something an old man at the counter said, her hazel eyes crinkling in a way that made Dante's chest tighten. It was that smile again, the one that didn't want anything from him. He took a seat in the far corner booth, the shadows clinging to him. When she finally turned toward his table, the smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face, her hands trembling so violently that the coffee pot she was carrying rattled against the ceramic mugs. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sizzle of the grill. "How did you? You aren't supposed to be here." "I told you I'd find you," Dante said, his voice steady, anchoring her in place. "You forgot to bow, Elara. I couldn't let that go." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the door as if looking for an exit. "I told you, I needed that job. Are you here to get me fired? To show me how much power you have?" Dante leaned forward, the light hitting the sharp angle of his jaw. "I'm here because I haven't slept a wink since last night. I'm here because every time I close my eyes, I saw you standing in that alley telling me I was lonely. No one talks to me like that. No one dares." Elara set the coffee pot down on a neighboring table, her fear morphing into that stubborn spark of defiance he'd seen in the alley. "And what? You want an apology? You want me to tremble like everyone else in that ballroom?" "No," Dante said, his gaze piercing. "I want you to sit down. I want you to tell me about the girl who doesn't bow to monsters. I want to know why a waitress from Brooklyn is the only person in New York who can make a Moretti freeze." The silence between them was a physical weight, a tether connecting 2 worlds that should never have touched. Elara looked at her boss, then back at the man who looked like he could buy the entire block just to keep her in his sight. "I have 10 minutes before my shift ends," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "But if you're looking for a performance, Mr. Moretti, you've come to the wrong place. I don't have a gown, and I don't have a script. Good, Dante replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in years. Because I'm tired of the theater. I just want the truth. As she slid into the booth opposite him, the air in the diner seemed to shift. Outside, the world of crime and commerce continued its brutal rotation, but inside that cracked vinyl booth, the ruthless boss was gone. There was only a man, a girl, and a curiosity so intense it felt like the beginning of a war. Dante knew that by sitting here, he was painting a target on her back. He knew his father would see this as a weakness. But as Elara looked at him, really looked at him, he realized he would rather be weak with her than powerful alone. The hunt was over, but the danger was only just beginning. Because in Dante's world, the things you love are the things they use to destroy you. And as he watched Elara reach for a sugar packet, his mind was already calculating how many men he'd have to kill to keep her this close forever. The 10 minutes Elara promised stretched into an hour, the rhythmic clinking of cheap silverware and the hiss of the griddle fading into the background of Dante's focus. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a person as a pawn or a threat. He was looking at Elara Vance, a woman who spoke about her student loans and her mother's dialysis treatments with more bravery than his captain spoke about turf wars. "You're staring again," Elara said, poking at the remains of a blueberry muffin. She didn't look away this time. The shy waitress from the ballroom was still there, but beneath the surface, a quiet steel was emerging. "Is there something on my face, or are you just trying to figure out how to put a price tag on me?" Dante let out a short, dry laugh that startled even himself. "In my world, everything has a price. But you're an anomaly, Elara. You're sitting across from a man who could flatten this neighborhood with a phone call, and you're worried about whether I'm judging your uniform." "I'm worried about whether you're real," she countered, her hazel eyes searching his. The man in the alley was human. The man in the tuxedo was a statue. But this man, she gestured to his ink-etched neck and the way his hands rested perfectly still on the table. "This man looks like he's waiting for a reason to burn something down." Dante felt the air in his lungs grow heavy. She was reading him with terrifying accuracy. "I've spent 20 years burning things down, Elara. It's the only way to keep the shadows from moving in. My father taught me that mercy is just another word for weakness, and in the Moretti family, weakness is a death sentence." He found himself telling her things he hadn't even confessed to his therapist, about the brother he couldn't save, the weight of the old money menace that felt more like a cage than a kingdom, and the geometric tattoo on his neck that marked the day he'd officially given up his soul to the family business. He watched her expressions shift, from pity, to understanding, to a warmth that felt like a physical touch. "You aren't a monster, Dante," she said softly, reaching across the table. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, a fleeting, accidental contact that sent a jolt through his entire system. A monster wouldn't bother coming to a greasy diner in Brooklyn just to explain himself to a waitress. A monster wouldn't have eyes that looked that tired. The moment was shattered by the heavy vibration of Dante's phone against the table. He didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. The old guard was calling. Lorenzo's voice, when Dante finally answered, was tight with a fear that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Dante, get out of there. Now," Lorenzo whispered. "Your father found out about the diner. He's seen the GPS on the Ducati. He thinks you've been compromised. He's sending a cleanup crew to verify the distraction." Dante's blood turned to ice. He looked at Elara, at the soft tendrils of hair framing her face, at the way she was tilting her head in confusion. She was the hidden gem he had dragged into the light, and now, the light was a target. "I have to go," Dante said, his voice returning to that flat, lethal monotone that commanded empires. He slid a stack of $100 bills onto the table, more than she made in a month, but the look on her face told him the money was an insult. "Is it happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The world you live in, is it coming here?" Dante stood up, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire booth. "No. I won't let it. But Elara, listen to me very carefully. Do not go home tonight. Go to the address I'm going to text you. Don't ask questions. Don't talk to anyone in a suit." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the ruthless mask firmly back in place. But for one split second, he let her see the truth, the terror of a man who had finally found something he couldn't afford to lose. "I told you I'd find you, and I did. Now I have to make sure no one else does." He turned and strode out of the diner, the bell chiming like a funeral knell. As he kicked the Ducati into life, the roar of the engine drowned out the sound of his own heart. He had walked past 50 models and frozen for one waitress, but now he realized the ballroom freeze was the easy part. Keeping her alive in a world built on blood was the real war. As he tore away from the curb, a black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner, heading straight toward the diner. Dante gripped the handlebars, his knuckles white. The ruthless boss was back, and this time, he wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. He had cracked his armor for her, and now, he would have to become a monster once more to protect the woman who saw the man beneath it. The smell of burnt coffee in the diner was replaced by the acrid scent of burning rubber as Dante pushed the Ducati to its absolute limit. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with the cold, calculated rhythm of a hit, but with the frantic desperation of a man who had finally found something worth losing. In his rearview mirror, the black SUV didn't slow down. It didn't signal. It moved with the heavy, ominous intent of a shark circling its prey. Dante didn't head for the bridge. He knew the Moretti old guard would expect him to flee back to the safety of his Upper East Side fortress. Instead, he swerved into the industrial labyrinth of the Brooklyn Navy Yards, the bike roaring like a wounded beast. He needed to draw the heat away from the diner. He needed to ensure that the cleanup crew followed the wolf, not the lamb. Back at the diner, Elara stood frozen behind the counter. The stack of $100 bills felt like a lead weight in her pocket. She looked at the door, then at the phone in her hand. "Don't go home," he had said. "Go to the address I text you." Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. She was a waitress who worried about rent and metro cards, not a woman who lived in a world of tinted windows and cleanup crews. But when she looked out the window and saw a second dark sedan idling across the street, the reality of Dante's world crashed down on her. The hidden gem was no longer hidden, she was a target. Dante skidded to a halt behind a row of rusted shipping containers, the metal groaning in the salt air. He didn't hide. He stepped off the bike, unbuttoning his tuxedo vest, the geometric ink on his neck pulse red with adrenaline. As the black SUV screeched to a stop 20 yards away, 4 men stepped out. They weren't street thugs, they were the shadows, his father's personal security, men who had carried Dante on their shoulders when he was a boy and had taught him how to clean a Glock before he could drive. Dante, the lead man, Marco, said, his voice like gravel. "Your father is disappointed. You missed the mayor's toast for a girl who pours coffee. He thinks your tactical awareness has been compromised by a pretty face." "My awareness is just fine, Marco," Dante replied, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "And if you or any of my father's men set foot in that diner, I'll remind you why I'm the one wearing the Moretti ring and you're the one standing in the dirt." The tension was a physical wire stretched to the breaking point. Marco sighed, a sound of genuine regret. "He didn't send us to kill you, Dante. He sent us to evaluate the distraction. If she makes you weak, she has to go. That's the law of the old guard. Tradition doesn't care about your heart. Tradition is just a fancy word for a cage, Dante spat. He stepped forward, his predatory gaze locking onto Marco's. Tell my father that the distraction is off limits. Tell him that if he wants to evaluate her, he has to go through me. And tell him that some traditions deserve to die. As Dante rode away, leaving the shadows in a cloud of dust and defiance, his phone buzzed. A single text from Elara, I'm at the address. It's a community center. Why am I here? Dante felt a surge of relief that almost brought him to his knees. He had sent her to the one place the Moretti family would never look, the small, struggling community center he secretly funded in the South Bronx, a place of hope that existed entirely off the family's books. It was the only part of his life that wasn't built on blood, and it was the only place safe enough for the woman who had cracked his armor. But as he turned the bike toward the Bronx, a chill settled in his marrow. He had protected her for tonight, but he knew his father. The Moretti patriarch didn't take no for an answer, and he didn't leave distractions alive. By choosing Elara over the 50 models, by choosing the truth over the performance, Dante hadn't just started a romance. He had declared a war. The ballroom freeze was long gone, replaced by a scorching heat that threatened to consume everything he had ever built. As he approached the community center, he saw Elara standing under a flickering street lamp, looking small and brave in her service uniform. She was waiting for him. And for the first time in 40 years, the ruthless boss wasn't thinking about the Empire or the Volkovs or the docks. He was thinking about how he was going to tell the woman he loved that his world was coming for her, and that he might have to become the very monster she feared just to keep her safe. The community center was a low-slung brick building that smelled of floor wax and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the Moretti estates. Inside, the air was quiet, save for the distant hum of a refrigerator in the small kitchen. Elara sat on the edge of a plastic chair, her service vest discarded, looking up as Dante entered. The ruthless boss looked different in this light, shadowed, weary, and stripped of the ballroom's golden armor. Why here, Dante? She asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. This place, it feels like a secret. It is a secret, Dante replied, closing the heavy deadbolt behind him. He didn't sit, he paced the perimeter of the room like a caged panther, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of the bold guards' headlights. This center is the only thing I own that doesn't have my father's fingerprints on it. No one in the family knows I fund it. To them, it's just a line item in a shell company's tax return. It's the only place where the Moretti name means nothing. Elara stood up, walking toward him until she was close enough to see the pulse thrumming in his tattooed neck. You're hiding me. Not just from the men in the SUVs, but from your own life. Dante stopped his pacing and looked at her, his predatory gaze softening into something raw and vulnerable. I'm hiding you because you're the first thing I've ever had that was worth protecting. In my world, everything is a transaction. You're a miracle I didn't see coming. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that seemed to surprise them both. I walked past 50 of the most beautiful women in the world, Elara. They were statues. But you forgot to bow, and it reminded me that I was human. The atmosphere shifted, the tension between them tightening into a heavy, electric silence. It was the near-miss physical tension of the ballroom, but now there were no cameras, no models, and no rules. For the first time, Elara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her hazel eyes searching his face for the man beneath the monster. I'm scared, she whispered. I'm a waitress from Brooklyn, Dante. I don't know how to survive a war. You won't have to, Dante promised, his voice a low, lethal vow. I'll burn the city to the ground before I let them touch you. But you need to understand who I am. The tattoos, the money, the violence, it's not just a mask. It's my blood. He began to tell her the truth about the old guard, about his father's obsession with a legacy built on fear. He spoke of how he had been groomed to be a weapon, not a man. As they sat on the floor of the community center, surrounded by donated toys and half-read library books, the billionaire hitman shared his darkest fears. He admitted that his biggest terror wasn't the Volkovs or the police, it was the idea that he might eventually become exactly like his father, a man who couldn't recognize beauty unless he could control it. "You won't," Elara said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Because you chose to come here. You chose the girl who forgot to bow over the women who were taught to make you feel like a king." But while they found a fleeting sanctuary in each other's arms, the world outside was moving. 10 miles away, in a sprawling mansion on the Long Island Sound, a different kind of storm was brewing. Dante's father, the Moretti patriarch, sat in a darkened study, staring at a grainy surveillance photo of the Brooklyn diner. His face was a mask of cold disappointment. "The girl is a liability," the older man said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "Dante thinks he can have a heart and an empire. He's forgotten that a king who bows to his emotions is a king who loses his head." The patriarch gestured to Marco, the lead enforcer. "If my son won't remove the distraction, we will do it for him. Find her mother. Let her know that her daughter's accident at the gala has a price." Back at the community center, the sun began to peek through the blinds, casting long, golden bars across the floor. Dante watched Elara sleep, her head resting on her folded arms. She looked like a hidden gem that had finally been found, but he knew the cost of discovery. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a single message from Lorenzo: "The shadows have moved. They aren't looking for Elara anymore. They're looking for her mother." Dante's blood ran cold. The curiosity that had sparked a romance was now a fuse leading to an explosion. He realized that by freezing in that ballroom, he had set a sequence of events in motion that he couldn't stop. He had cracked his armor for her, and now, his enemies were going to use that crack to destroy everything he loved. The ballroom freeze was over, and the night of sanctuary was ending. As Dante gently woke Elara, he knew that the next 4 hours would decide their future. He had to decide if he was going to be the man who protected her, or the monster who let her go to save her life. The golden light of the morning was shattered by the shrill, persistent vibration of Elara's phone on the wooden floor. She sat up abruptly, her eyes bleary with sleep, but the second she saw the caller ID, her blood ran cold. "It's my mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She never calls this early. She knows I'm usually sleeping off the Waldorf shift." Dante was on his feet before she could even press talk. He watched her face drain of color, her hazel eyes widening in a way that mirrored the terror of the ballroom, but this was worse. This wasn't a social mistake, this was a life being dismantled. "Elara? Honey, I'm fine, but, there are men here," her mother's voice crackled through the speaker, thin and brittle with fear. "They're in suits, Elara. They're sitting in the living room like they own the place. They said they were friends of yours from the gala. They said you left something behind and they wanted to negotiate its return." Dante didn't need to hear another word. He grabbed the phone from Elara's shaking hand, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that could have frozen the sun. "Marco. Put the phone down and leave that house. Now." There was a pause, a dry, mocking chuckle on the other end. It wasn't Marco. It was the voice of the man who had raised Dante to be a killer. "Dante. You always were too sentimental for your own good. You've been hiding in a brick box in the Bronx while the world moves on without you. Your mother would be disappointed, son. She raised a lion, not a house cat." "Don't talk about my mother," Dante hissed, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. And don't you dare touch that woman. She has nothing to do with this. She doesn't even know who I am. That's where you're wrong, the patriarch replied, his voice chillingly calm. She knows everything now. I've explained the Moretti legacy to her. I've explained that her daughter is currently the only thing standing between the Moretti family and a very lucrative alliance with the Volkovs. You see, Dante, your little freeze in the ballroom was caught on several high-resolution cameras. The Volkovs think you're distracted. They think the Moretti blood has gone thin. And in our world, when blood goes thin, people start to bleed. Dante looked at Elara. She was standing in the center of the room, her hands over her mouth, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. She was the hidden gem he had dragged into a world of vipers, and now the vipers were at her mother's throat. What do you want? Dante asked, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. I want you to be the man I built, his father said. Come home. Bring the girl. We'll settle this as a family. If you don't, well, I'm sure the hospital wouldn't want to hear that Mrs. Vance's dialysis treatments have been accidentally discontinued due to a lack of funding. It's a tragedy how quickly the world moves, isn't it? The line went dead. Dante dropped the phone, the silence of the community center suddenly feeling like a tomb. He felt the ruthless boss mask sliding back into place, but this time, it was different. It wasn't for show. It was for war. He walked over to Elara, his hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Elara, listen to me. I'm going to get her back. I'm going to end this. How? She sobbed, her body racking with tremors. He's your father, Dante. He has an army. You're just one man with a bike and a tattoo. I'm a Moretti, he reminded her, his predatory gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that was almost frightening. And he forgot one thing. He taught me how to find weaknesses. He taught me how to wait for the exact moment to strike. He thinks I'm the lion he raised? No. I'm the monster he created, and he's about to find out that monsters don't have masters. He led her out of the community center, his mind already spinning through the tactical awareness that had kept him alive for 40 years. He knew he couldn't just walk into the mansion. He needed leverage. He needed to be the billionaire hitman one last time. As they rode back toward the city, the skyline of Manhattan looming like a jagged, glass fortress, Dante felt the final pieces of his old life falling away. He had walked past 50 models and frozen for one waitress, and now, he was prepared to walk through hell to keep her. But as they crossed the bridge, a text from Lorenzo flashed on his dashboard, the Volkovs are at the mansion. Your father didn't just call you home, Dante. He called a meeting. He's going to use Elara as a peace offering. Dante isn't just fighting his father anymore, he's walking into a room full of the most dangerous men in the world. Will he be able to save Elara's mother before the Volkovs claim their prize? Or will the old guard successfully sacrifice the hidden gem to save their dying empire? The Moretti mansion loomed like a stone tomb against the graying New York sky, its iron gates swinging open as if the house itself were a predator unhinging its jaw. Dante didn't slow down. He accelerated, the Ducati's roar echoing off the manicured hedges as he pulled into the circular driveway. He didn't park, he dropped the bike, the heavy metal clattering against the gravel, and reached for Elara's hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was tight, a silent pact between the waitress and the boss before they stepped into the lion's den. Remember, Dante whispered, his voice vibrating with a frequency that promised violence to anyone who breathed in their direction. Don't look at the models. Don't look at the Volkovs. Look at me. I am the only thing in this house that matters. Inside, the grand foyer was a grotesque mirror of the Waldorf Gala. 50 supermodels had been brought in to line the hallway, a decorative wall of perfection, designed by his father to remind Dante of the world he was supposed to lead. But they were blurs of color to Dante. He walked past them without a sideways glance, his tuxedo jacket open, the geometric tattoo on his neck stark against his pale skin. He looked like a man who had already died and come back for vengeance. They reached the double oak doors of the great hall. 2 of the patriarch's personal guards reached for Elara, but Dante stepped between them, his predatory gaze pinning them to the wall. "Touch her," he rasped, "and you won't live long enough to regret it." Image, Dante standing protectively in front of Elara in a room full of armed men and glamorous women. The doors opened to reveal a scene of chilling business. His father, the Moretti patriarch, sat at the head of a long mahogany table. To his right sat Viktor Volkov, the butcher of Brighton Beach, surrounded by men whose scars told stories of Siberian prisons. And at the far end of the room, sitting on a velvet chair with a guard standing over her, was Elara's mother. "Elara," her mother cried, moving to stand, but the guard's hand on her shoulder forced her back down. "Dante. You're late for the negotiation," his father said, swirling a glass of amber liquid. "Victor was just telling me how much he admires our attention to detail. He was particularly impressed by the surveillance footage of you in Brooklyn. He thinks a man who finds beauty in a diner is a man who can be reasoned with." Reasoned with? Or blackmailed? Dante strode to the center of the room, his presence swallowing the light. He didn't look at the Volkovs. He looked at the man who shared his blood. "You brought the Volkovs into our home, father. You brought the butchers into the sanctuary. You've gone beyond tradition. You've gone desperate." Viktor Volkov stood up, his massive frame draped in an expensive, ill-fitting suit. He walked toward Elara, his eyes roaming over her monochrome uniform with a sickening, clinical interest. "So, this is the hidden gem. The one who forgot to bow. She is unpolished. But she has spirit. My brother in Moscow needs a new hostess for his clubs. Your father says she is the price for the shipping docks." Dante felt the ruthless armor within him lock into place, turning his heart to obsidian. The curiosity of the room was at a fever pitch, the models in the hall were whispering, the guards were tensing, and Elara was trembling beside him. Everyone was waiting for the boss to fold. Everyone was waiting for him to prioritize the empire over the girl. "The docks are yours, Victor," Dante said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her mother let out a sob. The patriarch smiled, a slow, triumphant expression of a man who thought he had finally broken his son. "But," Dante continued, stepping into Victor's personal space until their chests were inches apart, "the docks come with a condition. A Moretti condition." Dante reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, tossing it onto the table. It slid across the wood, stopping right in front of his father. "On that drive is the ledger for the Volkov Moretti offshore accounts," Dante said, his gaze shifting to his father. "The ones you've been using to skim from the family treasury for 10 years. The ones that prove you've been selling out our own captains to pay off your gambling debts in Macau." The patriarch's face turned from triumph to ash. The room went silent. Even the Volkovs looked at the drive with a new, dangerous hunger. "You wanted a negotiation, father? Here it is," Dante growled, his voice rising like a storm. "You release Mrs. Vance right now. You give Elara and her mother safe passage out of this state. And in exchange, I don't give this drive to the commission. I don't let the other families know that the ruthless patriarch is actually a common thief." "You wouldn't," his father whispered, his hands shaking. "It would destroy the Moretti name. It would destroy you." "I was destroyed the second you touched her family," Dante replied. He turned to Victor. And as for you, Victor, if you ever mention her name again, I'll find the bold guard secrets you've been hiding from the Kremlin. We can all burn together, or you can take your docks and leave my house. The tension was a physical weight, a near-miss moment that felt like it would shatter the glass chandeliers. For 30 agonizing seconds, no one moved. Then, Viktor Volkov laughed, a cold, appreciative sound. He has your eyes, Moretti, Victor said, looking at the patriarch. But he has the devil's heart. Keep the girl. She's not worth a war with a man who has nothing left to lose. Victor signaled his men, and they exited the room, the heavy thud of their boots signaling a shift in the underworld's power. Dante didn't wait. He walked to the end of the table, shoved the guard away from Mrs. Vance, and helped her up. But as he turned to lead them out, his father's voice cracked through the silence. You think you've won, Dante? You've just made yourself an exile. You have no empire. No name. You're just a man in a tuxedo with a waitress. Dante paused at the door, looking back at the wall of models, and the bitter old man at the table. He looked at Elara, whose hazel eyes were now filled with a fierce, burning pride. I walked past 50 models to find the truth, Dante said. And the truth is, I'd rather be a man with her than a king with you. They walked out of the mansion, leaving the bold guard to rot in their gilded cage. But as they reached the bike, a dark sedan pulled up. Lorenzo was at the wheel, his face grim. Dante, we have to move. Your father just put out the hit. The exile has a bounty, and every mercenary in the city is already checking their clips. The black sedan tore away from the Moretti mansion, the tires screaming against the asphalt as Dante watched his past disappear in the rearview mirror. Beside him, Elara sat with her mother, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. The ruthless boss was now officially an exile, a man without a throne, but as he looked at the geometric tattoo on his neck in the reflection of the window, he felt a strange, terrifying lightness. For 40 years, he had been a prisoner of his own name. Now, he was just a man with a target on his back. We can't go to your apartment, Elara, Dante said, his voice a low, tactical hum. And we can't stay in the city. My father's hit is already live on the dark web. Every 2-bit mercenary from Jersey to Queens is looking for a bespoke tuxedo and a girl in a waitress uniform. He signaled Lorenzo to take the back routes, avoiding the major bridges where the bold guard had eyes. They moved through the skeletal remains of the industrial districts, the shadows of the city stretching out like reaching fingers. Dante reached into the glove box and pulled out a burner phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. He wasn't just running, he was beginning the redemption arc. To save Elara, he had to dismantle the very empire he had helped build. Where are we going? Elara asked, her voice small but steady. She was no longer the trembling waitress who had forgotten to bow, she was the woman who had watched him defy a room full of monsters. To the only place they can't reach us, Dante replied. And to the only person who hates my father as much as I do. They arrived at a nondescript safe house on the edge of the Hudson, a place masked by the fog and the constant groan of shipping freighters. As they stepped inside, Dante turned to Lorenzo. Contact the captains of the 5 boroughs. Tell them the ledger on that drive wasn't just about my father skimming money. Tell them it contains the coordinates of every offshore vault and the names of every politician he's been paying off with their profits. If the family wants to survive, they need to cut the head off the snake before the feds do. The near-miss tension of the last few hours was finally settling into a cold, hard reality. Dante stayed up through the night, his predatory gaze fixed on a laptop screen as he leaked encrypted data to the authorities and rival families alike. He was burning his own inheritance to buy Elara's safety. He was the billionaire hitman turned whistleblower, a paradox that would have made his father's blood boil. Image: Dante in a dark room illuminated by computer screens, his tuxedo vest discarded, looking weary but determined. In the early hours of the morning, Elara found him on the balcony, watching the sun struggle to rise over the polluted river. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, her presence a warm contrast to the icy tactical world he had lived in. "You're destroying it all," she whispered. "Everything you were born to rule." "I was born to rule a graveyard, Elara," Dante said, turning to face her. The ruthless exterior was gone, replaced by a raw, naked honesty. "I walked past 50 models because I was looking for a reason to stop being a ghost. I found it in a girl who didn't bow. If I have to burn the world to keep that girl safe, then let it burn." But the peace was short-lived. Lorenzo burst onto the balcony, his face ash-gray. "Dante, the captains are revolting. Your father is cornered in the mansion, but he's not going down alone. He's activated the scorched earth protocol. He's sent a specialized team to the community center in the Bronx. He figured out it's yours." Dante's heart stopped. The center wasn't just a building, it was the one piece of his soul that remained uncorrupted. It was the place where he had taken Elara to keep her safe. "He's trying to draw me out," Dante growled, his jaw setting in that familiar, lethal line. "He knows I won't let that place burn." "It's a trap, Dante," Elara said, grabbing his arm. "He knows you'll come. He's waiting for you." "I know," Dante said, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. "But he's forgotten one thing. He taught me how to walk into a trap and come out the other side. He's still playing by the old rules. I'm playing for you." The smell of smoke didn't meet Dante in the Bronx, it was the silence that chilled him. He arrived at the community center ahead of the main cavalry, the Ducati's engine cutting out blocks away to preserve the element of surprise. The billionaire hitman was gone, replaced by a ghost in a tattered tuxedo. He moved through the shadows of the alleyways he had personally funded to be safe, his tactical awareness screaming that the scorched earth protocol had already begun. He saw them through the reinforced glass of the center's side entrance, 4 men, the dregs of the Moretti payroll, dousing the library, the room where he had first seen Elara sleep, with accelerant. They weren't just burning a building, they were erasing the only evidence that Dante Moretti was a good man. Image: a silhouette of Dante standing in the doorway of a darkened community center, the orange glow of a small fire reflecting in his intense eyes. Dante didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. He entered like a draft of cold air. The first man didn't even hear him move, he only felt the crushing weight of Dante's arm as he was neutralized into the drywall. The ruthless boss fought with a desperate, jagged energy he had never felt in the boardroom. He wasn't protecting territory or shipments. He was protecting the books Elara had touched, the chairs where she had sat, and the hope she had breathed into these walls. "Dante! Stop!" The voice came from the shadows of the stage. Marco stepped into the dim light of the emergency lanterns, his gun leveled not at Dante, but at the main gas line of the building. His face was a mask of conflict, the old guard loyalty warring with the respect he held for the boy he'd watched grow into a king. "Your father said you'd come," Marco said, his hand trembling slightly. "He said you'd choose this pile of bricks over the family name. He told us to wait until you were inside." "Then do it, Marco," Dante rasped, stepping into the center of the room, his chest heaving. The geometric tattoo on his neck looked like a brand in the flickering light. "If you think burning this place is going to make me come home, you've forgotten everything I am. This isn't just a building. It's the only thing I have that isn't soaked in blood. If you light that fuse, you aren't just killing me, you're proving that the Moretti name deserves to die." Marco looked at the gas line, then at Dante. "He's lost, Dante. The captains turned. The feds are at the gates of the mansion. He's gone mad. He thinks if he can't have the empire, no one can. Then don't be his last mistake, Dante said, taking a slow, steady step forward. Help me save the one thing that's left. The curiosity sensor of the audience peaks as Marco lowers the weapon. But the scorched earth protocol wasn't a one-man job. A secondary explosion rocked the back of the building, a preset charge that Dante hadn't accounted for. The ceiling groaned, and a beam of heavy oak, centuries old, began to buckle. Outside, Elara had ignored Dante's orders. She had arrived in a taxi just in time to see the windows of the center blow outward, shattered glass raining down like diamonds on the pavement. She screamed his name, her voice lost in the roar of the flames that were finally taking hold. She didn't see a boss or an exile, she saw the man who had frozen for her, now trapped in a furnace of his own making. Dante felt the heat searing his lungs. He looked at the library, the flames licking at the edges of the hidden gem sanctuary. He had a choice: he could save himself, or he could try to save the records, the history, and the heart of the center. He didn't hesitate. He dived into the smoke. Image, Dante reaching through a wall of fire to grab a small, charred box, the center's founding documents. He emerged minutes later, his tuxedo scorched, his face smeared with soot, stumbling out of the front doors just as the local fire department's sirens began to wail. He collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air, clutching a small metal box to his chest. Elara was there in an instant, her hands frantic on his face, her tears washing away the ash. "You're insane," she sobbed, pulling him against her. "It's just a building, Dante. Why would you go back in?" Dante coughed, a rough, painful sound, and opened the box. Inside wasn't money or ledgers. It was a photo of the first group of kids who had used the center, and a small, dried flower Elara had left on the table during their night of sanctuary. "Because I promised I wouldn't let them touch you," he whispered, his voice broken. "And I wasn't just talking about your body. I was talking about your world." As the community center burned behind them, the old guard era officially ended. The mansion had fallen, the patriarch was in custody, and the ruthless boss was sitting on a curb in the Bronx, holding a waitress and a handful of ashes. He had lost his empire, his wealth, and his throne. But as he looked into Elara's wide, hazel eyes, he realized he had finally found the one thing 50 models could never give him: a future. The ballroom freeze had led to a Bronx fire, and from the wreckage, something new was rising. But as a black car pulled up, not a Moretti car, but a plain, unmarked sedan, Dante knew the transition wasn't over. The feds were here, and the price for his redemption was about to be tallied. The sirens of the unmarked sedans were a low, rhythmic thrum against the backdrop of the smoldering community center. Dante didn't try to run. He sat on the curb, his hands coated in the soot of his burning legacy, and watched as the federal agents formed a perimeter. For the ruthless boss, this was the final bill for a life of old money violence, but as he looked at Elara, he realized he was no longer afraid of the cost. He was only afraid of the silence he might leave behind. Dante Moretti, the lead agent said, stepping into the flickering light of the fire. "We've been analyzing the data on that drive you leaked. It's enough to bury your father, the Volkovs, and half the city council. But it also puts you at the center of a decade of racketeering." Elara stepped forward, her voice a fierce shield against the cold reality of the law. "He saved me. He saved this center. He gave you everything you needed to stop the monsters." Dante reached out, his soot-stained fingers gently catching her wrist to pull her back. "It's okay, Elara. I'm not a victim here. I'm a man who finally decided to pay his debts." He looked up at the agent, his predatory gaze now steady and focused. I'll give you a full confession. I'll testify against every name on that drive. But I have one condition. A Moretti condition. The agent hesitated, sensing the gravity of the billionaire hitman making his final play. What is it? Total immunity for Elara Vance and her mother. A witness protection detail that stays with them until the last Moretti loyalist is behind bars. And, Dante paused, glancing at the charred remains of the center, I want the assets seized from my personal offshore accounts, the ones my father didn't know about, to be placed into a blind trust. I want this center rebuilt. I want it to be a place where no one ever has to bow to anyone again. The negotiation was a near-miss moment that felt like it lasted a lifetime. Finally, the agent nodded. We can make that happen. But Dante, you're looking at 10 years, minimum. Even with the cooperation. Then let's get started, Dante said, standing up. He turned to Elara, the geometric tattoo on his neck stark against his pale skin. He looked at her one last time before the handcuffs clicked, a sound that usually signaled the end of a story, but for them, it felt like a beginning. I walked past 50 models to find someone who saw the man beneath the monster. Don't let the monster win while I'm away. I'll be waiting, she whispered, her hazel eyes burning with a promise that no prison could break. I don't care how many years it takes. I'm not going anywhere. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of courtrooms and headlines. The ruthless boss became the city's most famous witness, dismantling the Moretti empire brick by brick from a high-security cell. Every night, he received a letter, simple, unpolished notes from Elara, telling him about the progress of the community center's reconstruction. She sent him photos of the new library, the books she was choosing, and the hidden gem garden she was planting in the courtyard. But the old guard didn't go quietly. Even from behind bars, his father's reach was long. Dante survived 3 attempts on his life in the first year alone, a shank in the mess hall, a poisoned meal, a staged riot. Each time, he fought with a jagged, desperate energy. He wasn't fighting for power anymore, he was fighting for the epilogue he had promised himself on that curb in the Bronx. The curiosity of the public was insatiable. Underworld Love Chapters filled the tabloids. Was it a real romance, or was the Waitress just a pawn in a sophisticated legal play? Only Dante and Elara knew the truth. They were 2 people from different worlds who had crashed into each other in a moment of social defiance, and the wreckage had turned into a foundation. As the years began to blur, the billionaire hitman persona faded, replaced by the image of a man who spent his hours in the prison library, studying the law he had once broken. He was cleaning his own soul, one day at a time, preparing for the moment he could finally step out of the shadows. The heavy iron gates of the correctional facility groaned open, a sound that had haunted Dante Moretti's dreams for 3,000 nights. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, not as the billionaire hitman, or the heir to a criminal dynasty, but as a man who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a folded stack of letters. The tailored tuxedo was long gone, replaced by a simple dark coat, but the geometric tattoo on his neck remained, a permanent reminder of the skin he had shed to become someone worthy of the woman waiting on the other side. Dante squinted against the sunlight, his predatory gaze scanning the perimeter. He knew the world hadn't forgotten the Moretti name. The old guard was a wounded beast, and though his father had died in a prison infirmary years ago, the ghosts of the syndicate still lingered in the shadows of New York. His tactical awareness, honed by years of survival, told him he wasn't alone. A black sedan was idling 100 yards down the road, not a federal vehicle, but one with the distinctive, heavy tint of the underworld. Image, Dante standing outside a prison gate, looking toward a mysterious black car in the distance. He began to walk, his heart hammering with a rhythm that was no longer dictated by violence, but by hope. He had spent years dismantling his father's empire from a cell, turning state's evidence and bleeding the family's offshore accounts dry to fund the community center's rebirth. He had made himself the most hated man in the mafia to ensure Elara could live in a world where she never had to bow again. But as the sedan's door opened, Dante realized the past wasn't finished with him. "Dante. You look thin," a voice called out. It was Marco. The man who had almost burned the Bronx for a dying king stood by the car, looking older, his face etched with the weariness of a soldier without a war. Dante didn't break his stride. "I'm not a boss anymore, Marco. And I'm not interested in whatever message the remaining captains sent you to deliver." "They didn't send me," Marco said, holding up his hands to show they were empty. "The family is gone, Dante. You did it. You actually burned it all down. I'm here because I promised your mother I'd see you the day you walked out. And because there's someone else who's been counting the minutes." Marco stepped aside, and the rear door opened. Elara Vance stepped out, and for the second time in his life, Dante Moretti froze. She wasn't wearing a service uniform or a monochrome vest. She was in a simple green dress that caught the light, her light brown hair flowing freely around her shoulders. The hidden gem had finally been allowed to shine without the weight of the underworld pressing down on her. She looked at him with hazel eyes that were no longer wide with fear, but brimming with a fierce, unwavering love. Image, Dante and Elara seeing each other for the first time in years, the prison walls behind them. "You didn't bow," Dante whispered, his voice breaking as he closed the distance between them. "I told you," Elara replied, her voice a steady anchor. "I only look at the man. And the man I see is finally free." The near-miss tension that had defined their first meeting at the Waldorf was replaced by a crushing embrace. Dante buried his face in her hair, the scent of vanilla and soap, the scent of his sanctuary, finally replacing the sterile smell of the prison. For a moment, the world of Underworld Love Chapters was silent. No hitmen, no ledgers, no legacies. Just a man who had walked past 50 models and a girl who had taught him how to live. But as they pulled apart, Marco cleared his throat. "Dante, the Volkovs, they haven't forgotten the docks. They've moved into the city. They know you're out. They don't want the throne, but they want the drive you used to bury them. They think you still have a copy of the Russian codes." Dante looked at Elara, then at the city skyline in the distance. He realized that the ballroom freeze was just the prologue. To truly be free, he had one last move to make, a final underworld play that would ensure the Volkovs never bothered Elara again. "I don't have the codes," Dante said, his gaze turning lethal for one last time. "But I have something better. I have the truth. And the truth is the only thing a man like Viktor Volkov is afraid of." The skyline of New York glowed with a predatory beauty, but Dante Moretti wasn't looking at the lights. He was looking at the reflection of Elara in the car window, realizing that the hidden gem was the only thing worth fighting for in a city built on shadows. He knew the Volkovs were close. He could feel the weight of their gaze, a cold, Russian winter pressing against the glass. Viktor Volkov didn't want a conversation, he wanted the codes he believed were hidden in Dante's mind, the keys to a digital kingdom that no longer existed. "Marco, stop the car," Dante commanded, his voice returning to that low, serrated edge that once commanded the 5 boroughs. "Dante, we're 3 blocks from the safe zone," Marco argued, his hands tightening on the wheel. "The Volkovs are right behind us." "That's exactly why we're stopping," Dante said, his predatory gaze locking onto the black SUV trailing them. "I'm tired of running, and I'm tired of being an exile. If Victor wants the ruthless boss, I'm going to give him one last performance." He turned to Elara, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Stay with Marco. If I don't come back in 5 minutes, you drive. You go to the center. You don't look back." Dante, no, Elara whispered, her hazel eyes wide with a mix of fear and that stubborn defiance that had first frozen him at the gala. You just got out. You promised me a future. I'm securing it, Dante said, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. I walked past 50 models to find you, Elara. I'm not letting a Russian butcher take that away. Dante stepped out into the middle of the deserted industrial street, the fog rolling off the Hudson like a shroud. He stood alone in the glare of the Volkov's headlights, his dark coat flared open, his hands empty and visible. The SUV screeched to a halt, and Viktor Volkov stepped out, his massive frame a silhouette of pure menace. The exile returns, Viktor growled, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade at his waist. Where are the codes, Moretti? My brother is losing patience, and the Kremlin wants their digital keys back. Image, Dante standing alone against the glaring headlights of a massive black SUV, a lone figure of defiance. Dante didn't flinch. He walked toward Viktor until they were close enough to smell the sulfur and cheap tobacco. There are no codes, Viktor. I burned the drive in the Bronx. Every bit, every byte, gone. The only thing left of the Volkov-Moretti alliance is the ash in my lungs. Viktor's face twisted into a mask of fury. Then you are useless to me. I'll kill you and take the girl. She'll fetch a fine price in Moscow. You could do that, Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a gunshot. But then you'll never know about the dead man's switch. You see, Viktor, I spent 3,000 nights in a cell with nothing to do but think. I didn't just leak my father's ledger. I set a timer. Every month I'm alive and free, a packet of data regarding your brother's private dealings with the feds remains encrypted. But if I disappear? If Elara is touched? That timer stops. The curiosity of the moment was a physical pressure. Viktor's eyes narrowed, his tactical awareness calculating the risk. In the underworld, a man with nothing left to lose was a man who planned for every ending. You're bluffing, Viktor spat, though his hand drifted away from his blade. Try me, Dante challenged, his predatory eyes flashing with a jagged, lethal light. Kill me now and find out how fast your empire crumbles when the Kremlin finds out you've been a witness in waiting for 5 years. Or, you can walk away. You tell your brother the codes are dead. You leave New York. And in return, I stay silent. We both become ghosts, Viktor. That's the only way out of this room. For a near-miss heartbeat, the world of Underworld Love Chapters hung in the balance. The fog swirled around them, the only sound the distant lapping of the river. Then, Viktor let out a short, bitter laugh. You always were a clever bastard, Moretti. You'd rather be a nobody with a waitress than a king in a cage. Viktor signaled his men and stepped back into the SUV. Stay a ghost, Dante. Because if I ever see your face in this city again, I won't care about the timer. The SUV roared to life and sped away, disappearing into the mist. Dante stood in the silence, the ruthless boss mask finally shattering for good. He turned back to the sedan, where Elara was already running toward him, her green dress a flash of life in the gray morning. Is it over? She asked, throwing her arms around his neck, her heart thudding against his chest. It's over, Dante promised, his voice thick with emotion. No more kings. No more empires. Just us. As they drove away from the industrial ruins, the sun finally broke through the Manhattan clouds, reflecting off the glass towers like a sign of peace. Dante looked at the letters in his lap, the unpolished notes from a girl who saw the man beneath the monster. He had lost everything his father had built, but as he held Elara's hand, he realized he was the wealthiest man in New York. The ballroom freeze had led to a Bronx fire, and the fire had forged a man who was finally worthy of the hidden gem. The transition was complete. The exile was home. 1 year had passed since the night the Moretti empire finally crumbled into the dust of the Bronx, and the city felt different, lighter, as if the shadows had retreated from the street corners. Dante Moretti stood in the hallway of the rebuilt community center, adjusting the sleeves of a simple charcoal suit. There was no velvet lapel today, no old money menace, and no wall of supermodels waiting for his approval. He caught his reflection in a framed photo on the wall. The ruthless boss was gone, replaced by a man whose intense gaze had finally found peace. The geometric tattoo on his neck was still there, but it no longer felt like a brand of violence, it was a scar of a life he had survived. "You're shaking, Dante," a voice chuckled. Marco stepped into the light, dressed in a suit that actually fit him for once. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying a small velvet box. "I've seen you walk into a room of Volkov enforcers without blinking, but a wedding in a community center has you trembling?" "Because this matters, Marco," Dante said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of sincerity. "The Volkovs were just business. This is my soul." The ceremony wasn't held in a cathedral or a ballroom at the Waldorf. It was held in the very heart of the center Dante had burned and rebuilt. The scent of fresh lilies and cedar filled the room, replacing the memory of smoke. Outside, the kids from the neighborhood were playing on the new basketball courts, their laughter a symphony that was far more beautiful than any gala orchestra. The music began, a soft, acoustic melody that drifted through the open windows. Dante took his place at the makeshift altar, his tactical awareness now focused entirely on the double doors at the back of the hall. When they opened, the world once again froze for Dante Moretti. Elara Vance didn't wear a designer gown worth a year's rent. She wore a simple, flowing white dress that made her look like the hidden gem she had always been. Her light brown hair was pinned back with a single white rose, and her hazel eyes were locked onto his with a clarity that brought Dante to his knees. She walked down the aisle on her mother's arm, her posture no longer hunched or shy, but radiant with the strength of a woman who had saved a king from himself. As she reached him, Dante didn't wait for the officiant. He took her hands in his thumbs tracing the soft skin he had once been afraid to touch. "I walked past 50 models," he whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. "I spent 40 years looking for a reason to stay in the light. And all it took was a waitress who didn't know how to bow." "I'm still not bowing, Dante," Elara replied, a tear of joy tracking down her cheek as she smiled, that genuine, unpolished smile that had cracked his heart open. "But I am staying. Forever. Forever," Dante promised. The Underworld Love Chapters had reached their final page, but for Dante and Elara, the real story was just beginning. They weren't an exile and a victim anymore, they were a man and a woman who had traded an empire for an alleyway and found that the alleyway was where the sun shined brightest. As they kissed, the room erupted into cheers, not the polite, calculating applause of the Manhattan elite, but the roar of people who knew what it meant to fight for something real. The ruthless boss had finally found his home, and it wasn't in a mansion or a vault. It was in the eyes of the girl who had forgotten the rules and, in doing so, had rewritten his entire world. Thank you for following the journey of Dante and Elara.